Now, normally, I'm not a proponent for comparing two different game systems, as this usually leads to flame wars leading to people trying to claim that one is better than the other. Well, today, I'm comparing two different game systems, and I'm sure you know which ones. Dungeons & Dragons has been compared to Pathfinder for a long time, and it makes sense. Pathfinder 1st Edition was basically Dungeons & Dragons 3.5.5. This reputation, however, has followed Pathfinder into its 2nd edition, and now, even though it's got a system all its own, it's still being compared to D&D 5th edition because they are both D20-based fantasy systems that use ability scores and skills. Now, I do agree that the two systems share a lot of aspects, but they're also critically different in multiple points of game design, namely character creation and combat. So what are these differences, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of each one? Howdy, my name is Nonat, and welcome to D&D vs. Pathfinder. Now don't get too excited, the name D&D vs. Pathfinder is 100% fuel for the YouTube algorithm. It just gets more clicks, I don't make the rules. In reality, I'm going to be comparing the two systems in an unbiased, logical manner and discussing the strengths and weakness of each one. Also, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be sticking with the Player's Handbook for 5e and the core rulebook for 2e. If we start bringing every supplement into existence for this discussion, we're going to be here for days. Sticking to the core rules for each system will give them both an equal ground to stand on, and hopefully these videos will be useful for new players who are trying to figure out which system is right for their table. And today, we're starting with something simple. Both systems have given the... Do you hear that? That sounds like today's sponsor! World Anvil is one of the most common names you'll ever hear in the TTRPG sphere, and for good reason. First off, they sponsor charismatic and handsome YouTubers to advertise for them. I'm talking about Guy. But beyond that, they boast such an incredibly wide variety of features. Most people know World Anvil as a campaign manager, but do you know what other things you can do with it? Design timelines, make a GM screen, make an interactive map, link maps together, make literal galaxies of world maps, roll digital dice, create interactive stat blocks, make an animated homepage, or write an adorable article about the Delintiarna. I don't know what this thing is, it was just in the promo footage they sent me, and I would die for him. World Anvil goes so far beyond just a simple world manager. It is an entire campaign manager. Everything from creating a party where your players can share notes, to actually planning out the events of each individual session, all the way to setting scheduled reminders so people will stop missing the session, Steve! So don't waste any more time. Click the link in the description and check out World Anvil for free today. I'm looking at you, Steve. Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder both boast the fighter class as being one of the most simple and accessible options when creating a character for the first time. The fighter fights, and they're good at it, but how does each system represent this martial prowess, and how do they differentiate from each other? Well, let's talk about it. I'll be going over 4 different aspects of game design in today's video: simplicity, flavor, efficiency, and balance. We'll start off with simplicity. Now, simplicity in itself is not necessarily a good thing. However, it is important to keep things as simple as possible to allow them to be approachable and not overly clunky. Understanding how easily a class can be picked up and how approachable it is for new players is important to discuss, because not all players want a character that requires 6 hours of research to play. The fighter is almost always described as the optimal class for a beginner player, so let's see which system made it the most accessible. The D&D fighter at level 1 only has one real choice to make when it comes to their class, and that's their fighting style. They start with Second Wind, and then a small bonus depending on what style they picked, and it's a pretty easy choice to make. Do you want to use great swords? Pick great weapon fighting. Do you want to use a rapier? Dueling. Sword and board? Protection or defense. Just like that, alongside your race and background, you have a fighter. Level 3 does up the complexity a little bit though, as you'll need to pick a martial archetype. Looking at the Player's Handbook, they have 3 options: the Champion, the Eldritch Knight, and the Battle Master. They'll also have access to Action Surge at this point, which is pretty self-explanatory. Once per day, you get to use an extra action. Neat. Out of those three, I would only consider one of them simple, and that's the champion. The champion just takes things the fighter was already doing and makes them better at it, namely critting on a 19 instead of just on a 20 and getting an extra fighting style at level 10. The other two options, however, can be a little overwhelming for new players. The Eldritch Knight turns the simple fighter into a half spellcaster. This gives them access to 2 cantrips and 3 first level spells. Now, a lot of people tell new players to avoid spellcasters for a reason. It can be a lot to take in, especially when you barely know how the game works. Having the character suddenly need to go over the entire wizard cantrip list and first level spell list at level 3 can be a bit much. It's not overly difficult, and if they're willing to put in a little bit of research, it's a great class for a new player. Plus, Bonded Weapon lets them teleport their weapon to their hand, and that's super cool. And this leaves the Battle Master, which I think is the most complicated fighter subclass in the player's handbook. Playing as a martial commander and spending superiority die to turn the tide of battle sounds incredibly fun, and it is, but it's not without its share of beginner's complexity. Similar to needing to read the entire spell list, the player gets an entire page full of single-spaced maneuvers that they're only allowed to pick 3 of, and they can't change again until I think level 7. These abilities also directly change how the game is played, allowing people to act on your turn, giving yourself bonuses, or even able to take extra actions after an attack can really make a new player a little bit confused about what they can and can't do. Now, all of these things I've been calling complexities are probably almost irrelevant to most of you as experienced players, but it's important to remember to look at these classes from the eyes of a fresh player. New people are joining these games daily, and something you and I might take for granted because we've read it 100 times might not make immediate sense to a new player. Giving these wide open choices can be suddenly overwhelming for a new player who just thought they were playing pretend with dice. Now let's take a look at the Pathfinder 2e fighter. The barrier for entry here, first off, is learning how to assign your proficiencies, but once you know how the proficiency system works, you can simply follow the sidebar and copy it onto your character sheet. Fighters in Pathfinder 2e have been made incredibly accessible as they have very few choices they need to make, especially right at character creation. All fighters start with attack of opportunity, they all start with shield block, and they get to pick one of 6 or 7 level 1 feats. These feats are also similar to the simple fighting style choice of the D&D fighter, as, depending on the weapon you want to use, you will likely pick the feat that corresponds with it. Are you dual wielding? Take double slice. Do you have a big weapon? Power attack. Using a shield? Reflexive shield. In fact, outside of their feat selection, the only choice a 2e fighter needs to make is their chosen weapon mastery. At level 5, fighters pick one weapon which bumps up to master proficiency, while the rest of them stay down at expert, so you could pick axes, swords, bows, etc. After that, the fighter's progression is pretty much static. But let's keep talking about feats, because I'm not going to pretend that the feat system of Pathfinder 2e is simple by any means. However, I'll expand upon the fighting style comparison. The fighter in Pathfinder 2e doesn't have a subclass. There is no Eldritch Knight, there is no Battle Master. Instead, the subclass is built right into the feat selection. Do you want to use great weapons? There's an entire list of feats that are there to benefit your great weapons. Do you want to use archery? Take point blank shot, double shot, triple shot. If you want to play a fighter that just uses one specific type of weapon, you can simply look at the feat list and pick the one that has your weapon type as a requirement. Now, this all isn't to say that the fighter is oversimplified. In fact, part of the fighter's spice comes from their ability to use any weapon just as good as any other class, with one of them being better than the rest. This doesn't mean they're worse with the other weapons. So, you can take certain feats at higher levels because most of them don't have prerequisites. Have you been focusing on using a greatsword, but you want to grab a bow for some ranged opportunities? Cool. At level 4, take double shot. You don't need to have taken a level 1 or 2 archery feat. Sure, you might have picked great weapon feats, but now you're good with a bow and a greatsword. Level 5 comes around and you might bump your greatsword proficiency up to master, but your bow is still at expert. That's on par with every other class in the game, and you have this cool double shot feat. This allows you to make the fighter either as simple or complicated as you like. You can focus entirely on one weapon and just take those feats, or take little feats here and there to support all kinds of different weapon types and become more of a weapon master. Flavor is an interesting aspect of game design that sometimes gets less of a priority over fun factor or mechanical balance. The details of a well-designed class will be both mechanically sound and teach you exactly what that class does and their place in the world just through their features. Let's look at the two systems and see just how much flavor they've squeezed into the vanilla fighter class. Also, when I'm talking about flavor, I'm not talking about the flavor text at the beginning of chapters where they describe a fighter or something. No. Flavor within mechanics is much harder to design, but equally important. When my class feature gives me something, I want to know why I have it and what it does. The fighting style is a great start for the D&D fighter. Right at level 1, you get to pick exactly what type of combatant you're specializing as, whether it's defensive, long range, close range, or what type of weapon. And Second Wind is fine as well, though it's always felt more like a barbarian ability to me. My personal issue I have with fighting styles is that paladins and rangers get them too, though it is a nice touch that fighters can pick from all of them, while the paladin and ranger fighting styles are a smaller selection. Now, the fighting styles are a bit hit or miss for me when it comes to flavor. The champion especially is just kind of boring. You're just better at hitting things, and for some reason, once you're a high level, you heal every turn for some reason. The Eldritch Knight is a lot better, though. The spellcasting is cool and all, but the bonded weapon really seals the deal for me, something that differentiates the class, and even though disarm might not be that common in D&D 5e, the fact that your bonded weapon cannot be disarmed from you is such a cool touch they didn't need to add. That little bit of mechanic gives it a lot more flavor, and being able to summon it from everywhere, the Eldritch Knight is just dripping with flavor for me. Finally, the Battle Master does feel like a master of battle. Using your superiority dice to give yourself extra attacks, throw additional effects on your attacks, or even bolster your allies to give them an extra attack, all really reflects the feeling of being a combat commander while keeping it balanced with the superiority die, making it, limited uses. But overall, the mechanics absolutely reflect what the subclass is going for. Overall, aside from the champion, the D&D fighter does drip with flavor, and the choices you make at each level really feels like it matters not just for your character sheet in the game, but for your character themselves and the specialization they've committed themselves to. On the other side of things, Pathfinder 2e's fighter feels a little bit disjointed when it comes to flavor. When it comes to the base class, you pick a weapon. You are legendary with that weapon. That's it. Everything else you get will be almost the exact same as every other fighter. Your saving throw proficiencies, your armor proficiencies, everything that scales up from base class features is not going to change from fighter to fighter. The feats, of course, will allow you to specialize in the weapon or weapons you want to focus on, and that might be enough flavor for people. A fighter who only picks archery feats is going to be drastically different from a fighter who only picks greatsword feats. The freedom of choice, however, that we talked about earlier is sort of a curse when it comes to flavor. Like I said, a lot of these feats don't have prerequisites, which means at level 4, even if you didn't pick any of the other archery feats, you can still take double shot. Well, this is true all the way to level 18. If you spent 17 levels only picking greatsword feats, you can still take Impossible Volley at level 18 because there is no prerequisite. This fighter never picked up a bow in their life, spent 17 character levels only fighting with a greatsword, and can pick up a bow and attack any number of targets in a 10-foot burst. Don't get me wrong, it's cool, but it's also a little immersion breaking to just suddenly be this master archer with this impossible technique that no one else can do, even though you didn't train using a bow. So I could have called this next segment gameplay, but efficiency sounds so much cooler and importanter. The efficiency of a class comes from its impact on gameplay and overall fun factor to play. The class doesn't need to be able to make this massive splash, but just be consistently reliable in combat and simple to follow without slowing everything down. The turn of a D&D fighter is interesting. It can be anything from, I attack 3 times. to, alright, I attack, and since that attack hit, I use maneuvering attack to move my rogue in position next to this guy. Now I'm going to use precision attack to give myself a bonus on my attack roll, and finally, instead of attacking again, I'm going to use commander strike to give that rogue an additional attack on my turn for the sneak attack bonus damage. Weirdly enough, the champion martial archetype does have some decent combat efficiency. If you just want to play a fighter who hits things really hard with more common critical hits, the champion will do exactly that. Some people don't need spells and they don't need fancy maneuvers. They just want to walk up to someone with their greatsword, hit them, and say, oh boy, an 18, that's a critical hit. Plus it really speeds up combat as a champion if you're just going to attack 3 times a turn and not really do anything else. Meanwhile, the Battlemaster has tons of different options in combat, but a limited amount of times to use them between each short rest. This leads you to thinking almost like a Battlemaster. What? You need to figure out if it's the best time to use a superiority die, or just follow the champion's lead and hit it really hard. Then the Eldritch Knight has its own type of combat strategy. Unlike the Battlemaster, who uses their abilities to augment their attacks, the Eldritch Knight really needs to choose whether they're going to attack or cast a spell. It's almost like getting to play 2 different characters and switching between fighter and wizard whenever it suits you. Or you can even combine the 2 with spells like True Strength. I can't. The D&D fighter honestly masters combat efficiency. There's just enough there to think about without slowing everything down, and if you really just want to hit things really hard, they've got you covered. The Pathfinder fighter, on the other hand, has tons of options, except for when it doesn't. Similar to 5e, it's sort of in how you build it. You can build a fighter that just uses power attack. It uses its greatsword, takes power attack at level 1, and when leveling up, just takes feats that give minor bonuses here and there. Alternatively, you could play a true weapons master who has power attack for great weapons, double shot for bows, combat grabs for one-handed weapons, and a reflexive shield for shields. With this build, you're going to have completely different options for using completely different weapons in completely different situations, and that could cause a lot more choices to be made about whether you switch weapons, do you use this feat, do you just attack, and that becomes its own really complex fighter that if you don't know what you're doing, can really slow down combat. When it comes to actual gameplay, regardless of the system, you are at the mercy of your own character creation. The fighter is only as complicated as you choose to make it, so if it becomes your turn in combat and you can't think of what to do, remember, you did it to yourself. The final aspect I'm going to touch on today can be either the single most important or least important aspect of game design, depending on your table. Balance. Does the class work mechanically, and is it not overtuned when compared to similar class options? The D&D fighter is good. The fighting style gives it a couple little bonuses. It has the incredibly powerful action surge feature to effectively take 2 turns at once, and it is the only class that gets beyond 2 attacks per turn. This, on top of your subclass, can make for a fairly powerful character, but touching on those subclasses, I would not call them balanced between themselves. The Battlemaster can take extra actions, grant extra actions, and even give temporary hit points to their allies in the middle of battle. The Eldritch Knight can cast up to 4th level spells, all without sacrificing any of the basic fighter progression like extra attacks, and the Champion critically hits on a 19. Oh, and they can also jump a little farther than other fighters. So there's that. Sure, the Champion at level 18 heals every turn, which is super cool and powerful, but that's at level 18, and most classes do not get to level 18. As much as I've liked praising the Champion subclass for its simplicity, that simplicity also makes it far less powerful than its 2 counterparts. The extra 5% chance to critically hit is good, but it pales in comparison to maneuvers and spellcasting. And a big flaw in the design here is that complexity should not equal power. Let's compare the fighter to the closest class to them in the game, the Barbarian. While the fighter is focused on form and weapon mastery, the Barbarian is much more about raging and swinging their weapons around wildly to deal additional damage. Just like the fighter, the barbarian also gains an extra attack at level 5. This means until level 11, when the fighter gets their third attack, the barbarian is pretty much just better in 90% of situations. In fact, a berserker barbarian at level 5 can make 3 attacks per turn at the cost of exhaustion, and a bear barbarian can just take half damage from everything. The only thing the fighter really has over the barbarian at low levels is the action surge, and that's only once per day. Once that has been used, it's gone, whereas the barbarian gets to rage for a full minute twice. The 5e fighter is in a weird place when it comes to balance. For the first round of an encounter, they can be the single strongest person on the battlefield. They can attack 6 times on the first turn at level 11 with Action Surge. This first turn is massive and can do a ton of damage, but after that, the fighter becomes pretty limited in what they can do. The Battlemaster only has so many superiority die they can use between rests, and the Eldritch Knight only has a few low-level spells available to them. And the champion... well, the champion's just praying they roll a 19 or a 20. The fighter isn't weak by any means. In fact, they're probably one of the most well-balanced classes in the game. No matter which subclass you choose, however, the fighter will always suffer from a lack of resources, whether it's superiority die as the Battlemaster, spell slots as the Eldritch Knight, or the champion and their 1 action surge per day. The Pathfinder 2e fighter has a very similar problem, but a totally different outcome. They actually have 0 resources per day. In fact, there is only 1 feat in the entire core rulebook that has the frequency once per day. Now, they don't have anything even remotely close to D&D's action surge, but rather Pathfinder's fighters are limited by the 3 action economy of the system, as well as the multiple attack penalty. The Pathfinder fighter's class identity pretty much lies entirely in their proficiency bump above all other classes. While other classes start with trained in most weapons, the fighter is one of only 2 classes that starts with expert, and are one of the only classes that ever reaches legendary. Like I said earlier, as the fighter levels up, they don't get subclasses, they simply take feats that work with the combat style their character is aiming for. Most of these feats, especially the higher level ones though, are situational. Sure, some low-level ones like Double Slice might be used on more turns than not, but a lot of them like Combat Grab are not going to be used every single turn. Rather, they're going to be saved for when they are opportune and beneficial as an option. The basic strike action is the fighter's bread and butter, and they are designed completely around it. They do not get bonuses to grappling or diplomacy or stealth. They are good at attacking, and that is what they do. With the design of Pathfinder 2e's +10, -10 critical hit system, as well as the balancing of the damage that spellcasters can deal in this system, the fighter, in a vacuum, is likely the single strongest combatant. The fighter will always critically hit more often, miss less often, and they get tons of feat that make them even better at doing that. Just remember, a fighter without their weapon of choice immediately drops to one of the weakest characters in the game. Especially if they took all the feats for one type of weapon. If they lose access to that weapon, they're almost useless. If a fighter took point blank shot, double shot, triple shot, impossible volley, weapon mastery in bows, and they lose their bow, guess what? They're incredibly weak. They're not useless. In fact, they're still on par accuracy-wise with everyone else in the game, but they won't have access to their special feats, and they don't have anything else going for them when attacking with those weapons. When it comes to the 2 systems, obviously the fighters are drastically different, but what's funny to me is that most people like to say that Pathfinder is far more complicated than D&D 5e, and on a normal example, I would agree with you, but the fighter is actually the reverse. The Pathfinder fighter is just really good at hitting stuff, and they take feats that make them better or more efficient at hitting stuff. Meanwhile, the D&D fighter has action surges, second winds, superiority dice, spell slots, and Critical hits on a 19. Why is the champion so bad? The two systems take completely diverse takes on the same class, but now I want to hear from you. Which system's fighter do you prefer? Do you prefer the simplicity and focus of the Pathfinder fighter, or do you like the diversity and different examples of fighters you can make in D&D 5e? Let me know in the comments below. I'm done cutting out my dog making noise. You hear that? She has been causing a ruckus this entire time. I have over an hour and a half of raw footage, most of which is just me standing in place waiting for her to stop smacking her toys around. You apologize? Can you tell people to check out World Anvil and thank them for sponsoring this video? Can you give a shout out to my patrons and let people know that they can click the link down in the description to join the Known at One's Patreon page and help keep the channel alive? No. You can't. Because you're a dog. Thank you all so very much for watching. Let me know what you'd like to see on the next D&D versus Pathfinder by leaving a comment down below. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, Known at Ones.